The kettle was halfway to a whistle when I first heard him. And that is the detail I cannot stop returning to. Because for the rest of my life, I will associate the sound of water about to boil with the sound of a man who has been dead for 46 years asking, very politely, for help. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 61 years old. For the last 9 winters, I have been the principal keeper at Cape Mire Light, on the eastern shoulder of Nova Scotia, in a place most charts still mark as automated, because as far as the Canadian government is concerned, there is no one out here. The cottage on this cliff was reopened in 2014 as a weather and wildlife post, and I was hired because the Coast Guard was looking for someone willing to live alone through the cold months and watch a piece of equipment that no longer needed watching. I want to say that first. I'm not a romantic person. I did not come here expecting to find anything. I came because my husband had been dead for 14 months, and the house in Halifax was too full of him. And I had begun to understand that there is a kind of grief that only quiets when you walk it out to the edge of something. What I'm about to tell you, I have not told anyone. Not the department, not the maintenance crew, not the young woman from the visitor center who once asked, very gently, the right question and was sent away with the wrong answer. I am telling you because I am 61 years old, and the conditions tonight are turning. And the barometer in the kitchen has begun to make that small clicking sound it makes when the pressure falls past a certain point. And I do not know how many more of these winters I have in me. And somebody, eventually, has to know that the radio in this cottage is not what the inventory forms say it is. The radio is an old Marconi-style marine set, mounted on a shelf above the kitchen table. And according to 3 separate Coast Guard inventories that I have personally signed, it is non-operational and retained for heritage purposes. I have signed those forms without comment each time. The radio works, not always, not on demand. But every winter, between the first hard freeze and the thaw, on certain nights when the air pressure drops and the sea fog comes climbing up the cliff in that slow, deliberate way it has, the speaker hisses. And then a voice comes through. And the voice belongs to a man named Tobias Ellery, who drowned with 5 other men in the wreck of the trawler Marisol in February of 1978, 14 years before I was hired and 46 years before I'm sitting here telling you this. I know it is him because he says his name. He says his name and his vessel's name and his position. And he asks, with the flattened patience of a tired man, for any vessel in the area to please respond. He has been asking, on and off, for 46 years. I am not the first keeper who has heard him. I am the first keeper, as far as I can tell, who has been answered back. I want to be careful with that sentence, because I have spent 9 winters trying to find a different one, and I have not. So let me tell you how I got here. Slowly, the way it actually happened. Because the shape of it matters more than the fact of it. The shape of it is the part I'm still living inside. The first time I heard him, it was the 2nd week of January 2015. And I'd been at the Cape for about 2 months. I was making tea. The set above the table had been silent for so long that I had stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing a clock in a room you have lived in for years. I kept a wooden bowl of clementines in front of it, because the kitchen was small and every flat surface had to do double work. The hiss started under the kettle, and at first I thought the kettle was the source. Then the kettle clicked off, and the hiss did not. I turned around the way you turn around when you think a wasp is in the room. The voice that came through was not theatrical. I want you to understand that, because it is the thing that has unsettled me most over the years. People expect, in stories like this, that a dead man's voice will sound otherworldly or hollow or wet. Tobias Ellery sounded like a tired man on a working boat at the end of a long shift. He said, "Marisol, Marisol, this is Marisol. Position roughly 44 north, 62 west. We are taking water in the forward hold, requesting any vessel in the area, over. His voice had the cadence of a man who has already said the same sentence 11 times and is starting, privately, to suspect that no one is listening. Then a long pause. The kind of pause where you can hear someone deciding whether to swear. Then he said it again, his position slightly adjusted, his voice slightly thinner, and the hiss closed over him, like a hand laid gently across a mouth. I stood at the counter for a long time. The clementines were directly in my line of sight. I remember looking at them as if they were going to explain something. I did not pick up the microphone. I did not write it down. I told myself very clearly that I had imagined it. And then I told myself, almost immediately, that I had not. Both of those statements felt true at the same time. And I went to bed without resolving them. And I lay awake until almost 4 in the morning, listening to the wind work at the eastern window, which is the window that faces the sea. In the morning, I did what a reasonable person does. I went into the small archive room at the back of the museum side of the building, and I opened the keeper's binders. Cape Mire has handwritten logs going back to the 1950s, kept in careful blue ink by men who had nothing else to do with their evenings. I found Marisol on the third binder I opened. February 9th, 1978. A 72-foot wooden trawler out of Lunenburg. Lost with all 6 hands in a winter storm the keepers of that night had described as the worst sea in living memory. The keeper on duty was a man named Arthur Doyle. His entry for that night ran to 4 pages of increasingly compressed handwriting. He had logged the distress call at 11:42 p.m. He had relayed it to Halifax. He had logged in a hand that became, over the course of the night, almost unreadable, the failure of any rescue vessel to reach the position before the signal stopped at 1:17 a.m. The name of the man who had made the call, in Arthur Doyle's blue ink, was Tobias Ellery, second mate. I closed the binder. I sat in the archive room with my hands flat on the cold table, and I thought, very precisely, about my 2 options. I could report what I had heard, and I could file a formal note. And I could become, in the official record of the Canadian Coast Guard, a woman who hears things. Or I could decide that the radio was malfunctioning in some interesting way that produced, occasionally, residue from a long-ago night. And I could leave it alone. I chose the second before I'd finished thinking it through. And I've wondered every winter since whether that was a choice or a reflex. I want to be honest about something now. Because if I'm not, the rest of this will not make sense. When the hiss closed and I understood what I had heard, my first feeling, before the fear, before the confusion, was relief that no one else had heard it. That relief is the thing I've been carrying for 9 winters. It is the thing that has shaped, more than the voice itself, who I have become out here. I would like you, before I go any further, to notice something about yourself. When I told you I felt relieved that no one else had heard him, you may have thought less of me. You may also have understood immediately, in the way you understand things you have never said out loud. I am not asking you to choose which reaction is correct. I'm only asking you to notice which one came first. The order matters in stories like this. It tells you what you are really listening for. The second time was 3 weeks later. Same weather pattern. Low pressure, climbing fog, a temperature drop of about 8 degrees overnight, and that thin, crackling silence the cottage gets when the air itself has gone cold enough to feel solid. I was reading at the table, and I had, without quite deciding to, moved my chair so that I was facing the radio instead of the window. The hiss came up at 10:15. Tobias said his name and his vessel and his position. And then he said something he had not said the first time. He said, "Art, if you can hear me, Art, the bilge pump is gone. We cannot keep up with it. We need someone now. Art." Arthur Doyle, the keeper from 1978. I sat with that name in my mouth without saying it back. And I understood, in a way I had not understood the first night, that the radio was not playing a recording. A recording would not address the man who had once sat where I was now sitting. A recording would not know that Art had been on duty that night. A recording would not be calling for him. That was the night I started keeping a second notebook, not the official log, which sat on the desk by the door and recorded wind speed and ice and bird counts in my neat, slightly forward slanting hand. The second was a green-covered school exercise book I had brought from Halifax for grocery lists. I wrote the date, the time, the conditions, and the words I had heard, as best I could remember them. I did not write any commentary. I did not write what I thought it meant. I wrote it the way Arthur Doyle had written his logs, in short, factual lines, because I think even then I understood that I was beginning a record I might one day have to defend, even if only to myself. I did not pick up the microphone that night either. I want to tell you I did not pick it up because I did not know what to say. The truer answer is that I did not pick it up because I was afraid of what would happen if he answered me. Let me describe the Cape, because the place is part of what happens to a person out here. The headland runs about 1 kilometer out from the mainland, in a long, narrowing finger of granite and low spruce. And at the end of it, the cliffs drop 90 meters straight down to water that even in summer is the color of slate. The cottage and the tower sit 40 meters back from the edge. In summer, there are tourists. And a young woman named Margot Pelletier drives out from the visitor center in Pleasant Cove 3 days a week to give tours of the museum. In winter, the road is gated at the junction, and the only people who come out are the maintenance crew once a month, and the supply driver once every 2 weeks, and a man named Hector Brennan, who was 73 years old when I met him, and who had been, by his own description, keeping an eye on the light since before I was born. Hector was the keeper here from 1979 to 1991. He took over from Arthur Doyle, who retired the year after the Marisol. Hector knew Arthur. Hector also, I came to learn, knew about the radio. He had never spoken to anyone official about it. He had, over the course of his 12 years on the Cape, filled 3 notebooks of his own. I did not learn about Hector's notebooks until my 3rd winter. By then I had filled most of the green exercise book and started a second blue this time. I had heard Tobias Ellery, by my count, 41 times. The transmissions had begun to show a pattern. They came in clusters of 3 or 4 nights during particular weather windows, and then they stopped for weeks. Tobias was not always at the same point in his story. Sometimes he was early in the night, calmly reporting the water in the forward hold. Sometimes he was later, asking for Art by name, his voice tighter. Twice in those first 2 winters, I heard him at what I came to understand was the end. When the engine had failed and the boat had gone beam on to the sea, and his voice had quieted down to the polite, careful tone some people's voices take on when they have stopped expecting to be saved. Those nights I sat at the kitchen table with my hands flat on the wood, and I did not move until the hiss closed. By the end of my 2nd winter, I had begun to think of him as company. I am aware of how that sounds. I am telling you anyway, because if I leave it out, you will not understand what came next. I was a 53-year-old widow living alone in a cottage on a cliff, and 3 or 4 nights a month, for a few minutes at a time, a man's voice came into my kitchen, and I sat with it. I did not answer. I did not record him on any device. I wrote his words in my notebook, and I made tea, and I sat with him until he was gone. That was the shape my winters had. Hector came up to the cottage in the 3rd January. His truck had broken down at the gate, and he needed my phone. And while he waited for his nephew to bring out a battery, he stood in my kitchen drinking the tea I had made him. And his eyes went to the radio above the table. And they stayed there longer than was casual. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How often?" I did not pretend not to understand. I said, 3 or 4 nights a month, in the cold windows. He nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed a thing he had been carrying for 40 years, and he said, "Have you written him down?" I said yes. He said, "Show me." I brought him the green notebook and the blue. He sat at the table, and he read them, page by page, his reading glasses pushed down his nose. I watched his face the entire time. I saw on it the thing I have only ever seen on the faces of 2 or 3 people in my life, which is the look of a person discovering that the thing they thought was only theirs has been all along, also someone else's. He took his glasses off. He folded them slowly. He said, "I have 3 notebooks at the house. I will bring them tomorrow." He brought them. They were older than mine, the covers softened by years in a cold cupboard, and the handwriting was Hector's careful printing, dated from 1980 through 1991. Date, time, conditions, words. Tobias Ellery, position roughly 44 north, 62 west. Art. The bilge pump is gone. The same lines, the same pauses, the same slow narrowing of a man's voice from working tiredness to politeness to silence. We sat at the table, Hector and I, and we put my 2 notebooks beside his 3. And we did the only honest thing we could think to do, which was compare. We were looking, I think, for any sign that Tobias was changing, that he was learning, somehow, that he was dead, that his transmissions had become, over 46 years, in any way different from how Arthur Doyle had first recorded them on the night it actually happened. We did not find that. Tobias Ellery, as far as we could tell from 3 keepers' notebooks spanning 4.5 decades, was saying exactly what he had said on the night of February 9th, 1978, in exactly the same order, with exactly the same pauses, and with exactly the same gradual quieting toward the polite stretch at the end. He was not a ghost learning to be a ghost. He was something more difficult than that. He was the same 40 seconds of a man's death, played on a schedule we did not understand, on a piece of equipment that did not officially work. Then Hector said something that has not left me. He said, "Arthur knew." I said, "Knew what?" Hector said, "Arthur heard him the first winter after, December 78. He told me when he handed off the station. He said he had thought about reporting it, and he had decided not to, because there was nothing to do for the man, and reporting it would only mean other people would come out and try to make it stop. Arthur did not want it to stop." Hector looked at me very steadily across the table. The kitchen lamp made small twin reflections in his glasses where they sat folded on the wood. "Arthur said," Hector said, "that he thought of it as keeping watch." That was the phrase he used, keeping watch. It became, in my head, the phrase for the thing we were doing. It is also, I've come to understand, the phrase a person uses when they want to make a refusal sound like a service. There is one more thing Hector told me that afternoon, and I want to put it down here in its proper place, because for a long time, I treated it as a story he was telling, and I've only recently begun to treat it as a warning. Hector said that one night in the spring of 1981, in conditions very like the ones that produced the transmissions, he had picked up the microphone. He had not meant to. He had been 3 weeks into a fever. His wife was visiting her sister on the mainland, and he had not slept properly in days. Tobias had come on with the bilge pump line, and Hector had pressed the talk key, and he had said, "Tobias, this is Cape Mire. I hear you." I asked him what happened. Hector was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tobias stopped." He looked down at his hands. He stopped mid-sentence, and the hiss stayed open, and I could hear, underneath it, the sound of a man breathing, not Tobias's voice, just breathing, like someone in the room with him had taken the microphone. It went on for, I do not know, maybe 20 seconds. Then the hiss closed. "And after?" I said. Hector said, "He did not come back for 11 months. When he did, in February of '82, he was different. He had a new line. Before the bilge pump, before the polite stretch, he said, 'Please do not answer.' That was the first time. He has said it every transmission since." I had been hearing Tobias for 2 years by then. I went back through my notebooks that night after Hector left, and I checked. I had written it down 41 times without registering it. "Marisol, Marisol. This is Marisol. Position roughly 44 north, 62 west. Please do not answer. We are taking water in the forward hold." It had been there the whole time. I had treated it as a transmission convention. I had not understood that it was a request. The thing I want you to hold on to, as I keep going, is this. Tobias Ellery has been asking me, every time he comes through, not to do the thing I eventually did. The fourth winter, in late February, the conditions were unusual. There had been a long, mild stretch, and then a sudden, hard drop. And the fog came up the cliff thicker than I had ever seen it, climbing past the eastern window in slow vertical sheets, like a curtain being drawn from below. The pressure fell so far that the barometer in the kitchen made the small clicking sound I had not heard before. The hiss started at 11. I was at the table. The green notebook was open. A third one, red, that I had begun in January because the blue was nearly full, lay beside it. Tobias came on the way he always did. The name, the vessel, the position. Please do not answer. The water in the forward hold. I wrote it down. He said the line about art and the bilge pump, and I wrote that down. Then there was a pause longer than usual, longer than I had ever heard. And the hiss thinned in a way that made the kitchen feel suddenly larger, the way a room feels larger when someone has just left it. Then a different voice came on, a woman's voice. She said, "Eleanor." I want to be precise about this, because it is the thing I've thought about most. She did not say Eleanor Vance. She did not give a position or a vessel or a call sign. She said my first name once, in the tone of a woman trying to get the attention of someone in the next room. There was no urgency in it. There was no menace. It was the kind of Eleanor my mother used to say from the kitchen on summer evenings when supper was on the table, and she did not want to shout. Then the hiss closed. I sat at the table for a long time. The red notebook was open in front of me, and the pen was in my hand, and I did not write it down. That is the part I want you to understand. I wrote down every word Tobias Ellery said, that night and every night, with the discipline of a clerk. I did not write down the woman. I closed the red notebook. I put the pen on top of it. I went and stood at the window above the sink. I looked out at the fog, which had reached the top of the cliff now, and was beginning to lap at the foundations of the cottage, like slow water. I made a decision in my body, before I made it in my mind. And the decision was that the woman had not happened. I did not tell Hector. He came up the next week with a bag of frozen scallops his nephew had brought him. And we sat at the table and drank tea. And he asked, the way he always asked, anything new? And I said, he was at the bilge pump line, then the polite stretch, then silence. Hector nodded. He had stopped writing things down by then. He had given me his notebooks. He had become, in his own words, retired from the watch. I had become the keeper of the keeper's secret, and I did not want to share the new part of it, because the new part of it had said my name. I have asked myself, many times since, why I did not tell him. The easy answer is that I did not want him to think I was losing my mind. The harder answer is that I did not want to share her. Tobias Ellery was a man dying in 1978 whom 3 keepers had listened to across 46 years. He was, in a sense, the Cape's. The woman who had said Eleanor was, from the first second, mine. I had been singled out, in a place where I'd come specifically to not be singled out. And instead of frightening me, it had given me something I had not realized I'd been starving for. If you are still listening, I would like to ask you a thing I do not ask often. Have you ever kept a secret about yourself, not about another person, but about what you noticed, about what you were given, because telling it would have meant losing it? I am not asking rhetorically. I am asking because the next part of this story depends on the answer being yes, at least sometimes, for most of us. If it is not, then what I did next will sound worse than it was. If it is, then it will sound exactly as bad as it was, which is the version I'm trying to tell. The 5th winter, she came back. 3 times, always after Tobias, always after the polite stretch, always in the few seconds before the hiss closed, when the kitchen had that hollowed-out quality and the radio sounded, faintly, like a room. The first time she said Eleanor the same way she had said it the year before. The second time she said, Eleanor, are you there? The third time she said, Eleanor, the light is on. The light is on. I sat with that one for weeks. The beacon on the steel mast outside the cottage was on every night, automatically, from dusk to dawn, the way it had been since 1991. It did not need me. It did not know me. There was no reading of the light is on that made sense as a statement of fact, unless she meant the cottage light, the small yellow kitchen bulb above my table, which was indeed on, because I was sitting under it, writing down what Tobias Ellery had said. The light is on, in that reading, meant I can see you. That was the reading I settled on, and I did not tell anyone, and I did not write it down. And I went on making tea, and sitting at the table, and keeping the watch. I want to tell you about the 6th winter now, because it is the winter I began to understand that the radio was not only listening, it was paying attention. It started small. In late December, the kettle began to whistle one night, and from the speaker, under the hiss that had been there for almost a minute without resolving, I heard the woman say, Eleanor, the kettle. I had not yet noticed it myself. I have replayed that moment in my head 1,000 times. The whistle and her sentence were almost simultaneous, but hers was first. By a fraction of a second, but first. A week later, I had a small fall in the bathroom. Nothing serious, a slip on a wet tile that left a bruise on my hip. I did not tell anyone, because there was no one to tell. The next transmission, 4 nights later, after Tobias had finished, she said, Eleanor, you should be more careful in the morning. I had fallen in the morning. I had not said it aloud. I had not written it in the official log, because it was not the kind of thing that belonged there. I had not even, as far as I could remember, looked at the bruise in the mirror with any particular thought. In January, I dreamed about Daniel. I dreamed about him standing in the parking lot in Dartmouth where he had died, holding the bag of groceries he had been holding, looking at me with an expression of mild irritation, as if I had been late to pick him up. I woke up crying. I made tea. I sat at the table. 2 nights later, after Tobias's transmission ended, the woman said, "Eleanor, he was not angry with you. I want you to sit with that for a moment." I had not said his name aloud in years. I had not told the radio I had been married. I had not, on any of the inventory forms or in any of the logs, written that my husband's name had been Daniel. The woman on a radio that should not have worked in a kitchen on a cliff at the eastern edge of a country had told me on the 3rd week of January in my 6th winter that the man I had dreamed about 2 nights before had not been angry with me. I did not write it down. I closed the notebook. I went into the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. I understood, somewhere underneath the part of my mind that handled understanding, that I had crossed a line that did not have a name yet, and that I had crossed it not by doing anything, but by being a person around whom a thing was now happening. I want to acknowledge, because I think some of you have been waiting for me to, that I considered the simplest explanation. I considered seriously whether I was generating her myself, whether grief and isolation and the suggestibility of a woman who had spent too many winters listening to a dead man had finally produced, in my own brain, a voice that knew the things I knew because it was me. I have considered that explanation every winter since. I cannot make it fit. I am not clever enough, even unconsciously, to have written the line, "He was not angry with you," in a stranger's voice, and to have been surprised by it. I am not generous enough to have given myself permission to hear it. But I'm also not going to pretend that the other explanations are easier. I have read what I could find about atmospheric ducting, about the way certain weather conditions can cause radio signals to skip and persist and be received, in rare cases, decades from their source. I have read about residual charge in old vacuum tube equipment. I have considered all of these for Tobias Ellery. And any of them, or some combination, may be true for him. He is consistent. He never deviates. He is, by every measurement Hector and I devised, a recording. The woman is the part I cannot explain. She is not consistent. She responds to conditions in the room I'm sitting in. She knows my name. She knows when the wind is bad. She knows, or seems to know, that I am alone, and that I have been alone for a long time, and that I have arranged my life in such a way that being alone has become the thing I am most afraid of losing. So I stopped trying to explain her. I made room for her. That is the part I think you should hear most clearly, because it is the part that changed me. I want to tell you about Margot Pelletier now, because she is the part of this I handled worst, and I owe her, at minimum, the dignity of being in this account. Margot was 26 the first summer I knew her. She had grown up in Pleasant Cove, gone to university in Halifax, and come back the way some young people from small places do, with a degree in maritime history and no particular plan. She gave the museum tours from June to September, and she was very good at them. She had a way of standing in the old lamp room and describing, without melodrama, what it had been like to be Arthur Doyle on the night of the Marisol. And the tourists, who had come expecting a quaint hour, would go very quiet, and 1 or 2 of them, every tour, would step out onto the gallery afterward and look at the sea and not speak for a while. Margot was a serious person who had chosen to be cheerful, which is a particular kind of grace. In my 6th summer, she asked if she could see the keeper's logs. not the official ones. She had already seen those. She wanted to see, she said carefully, the other notebooks, if there are any. She had heard from her grandfather, who had been a fisherman out of Lunenburg in the 70s, that the keepers at Cape Mire had kept private records of things that did not belong in the official logs. She wanted to know if any of those had survived. She was thinking, she said, of writing something. A small book, maybe. A history of the station that included what the official history left out. I told her there were no such notebooks. I told her this while sitting at the kitchen table with my green and blue and red and, by then, yellow notebooks in a stacked pile in the cupboard behind me, 2 meters from where she was sitting. I told her this while Hector's 3 notebooks sat in a cardboard box under my bed, where I'd moved them after his stroke in the spring, when his nephew had asked me to hold on to any of the Cape stuff while they cleared his house. I told her this calmly, with the same flattened cadence Tobias Ellery used when he was reporting the water in the forward hold. And Margot looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she nodded and she said, "All right. Thank you, Eleanor." And she finished her tea and she left. I want to be clear about what I did there. I did not protect Hector, who was in a long-term care facility in Bridgewater by then and could no longer read his own notebooks. I did not protect Arthur Doyle, who had been dead since 2003. I did not protect the Coast Guard, whose interests in this matter I had stopped pretending to represent years before. I protected the radio. I protected my arrangement with it. I protected the woman who said Eleanor, who by that summer had said my name 11 times across 2 winters, and who had, on one occasion in late January of that year, said, "Eleanor, you do not have to be alone in there." That sentence, in the voice of a woman I did not know, in a transmission that should not have existed, on a radio that should not have worked, sitting in a kitchen on a cliff at the eastern edge of a country where I had come specifically to be alone, was the thing I was protecting from Margot Pelletier. I told a 26-year-old woman with a clean and serious interest in the truth that there were no notebooks, because I did not want anyone else to be told, by this radio, that they did not have to be alone. I have thought since about the shape of that decision. It was not a moment of cowardice. It was a moment of clarity, of the wrong kind. I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew Margot would have handled the notebooks well. I knew she would have written a careful book that did not name me. I knew also that if she wrote it, other people would come, and the Coast Guard would come, and the radio would be examined and possibly removed. And even if it were not removed, the woman who said Eleanor would stop saying Eleanor, because the conditions that produced her, whatever they were, would not survive being looked at. I chose the woman over the truth. I would like to tell you I regret it. What I can tell you is that I have not, in the 4 winters since, undone it. I went into the archive room that night after Margot left. I do not know why. I think I was looking for permission. I sat at the cold table where I had first opened Arthur Doyle's binder, and I took down the binder for 1979, the year after the wreck, the year Arthur first heard the radio, according to Hector. I had read it before. I had not read it carefully. I read it carefully that night. On the page for December 14th, 1979, near the bottom, in handwriting that was Arthur Doyle's, but tighter than the rest of his entries, there was a line I had not registered the first 3 times I had read it. It said, "Received transmission, source unknown. Did not respond. See private log, see private log." I sat with that for a long time. Arthur Doyle had kept a private log. Hector had inherited the station from Arthur. Hector had begun his own notebooks in 1980. Hector had never mentioned, in 3 winters of conversation, that Arthur's notebooks had also existed. They were not in the archive. They had not been in the cardboard box his nephew had given me. I had assumed, because Hector had said Arthur knew, that Arthur's knowledge had been carried only in conversation, the way fishermen carry weather. But Arthur had written "See Private Log" in his own hand, in an official binder, in a moment of, I think, momentary forgetfulness. The same kind of forgetfulness that had caused me to almost write the woman's voice into the red notebook before I caught myself. Arthur Doyle's private log existed. I went looking for it. I spent the rest of that summer and most of the next searching the cottage, the museum, the small, unheated outbuilding behind the tower where old equipment was stored. I found it in February, in my 7th winter, in a tin box on the highest shelf of the museum's archive room, behind a stack of donated nautical charts no one had touched since the 1990s. The tin had been painted green at some point, and the paint had cracked in long vertical lines. Inside was a single notebook, smaller than the ones Hector and I used, with a cardboard cover the color of weak tea, and Arthur Doyle's name on the inside in a younger man's handwriting. The notebook ran from 1978 to 1991. 13 years. Arthur had kept writing in it long after he retired. The early entries matched what Hector had told me. Tobias's transmissions in clusters on cold nights. The lines about the bilge pump. The lines about art. Then, on the page for March 3rd, 1981, in handwriting that was Arthur's but unsteady, there was an entry that stopped me. It said, "Hector picked up the mic on the 27th. He did not tell me until tonight. Tobias has stopped. There is breathing now. The breathing is not his." And then 4 lines down, in a different ink, as if written on a different day. "The breathing is a woman. I have heard it twice since Hector told me. She has not spoken yet. I do not think she is from the boat." I sat in the museum archive room with the notebook open on my lap. And I understood, in a slow, cold way, that the woman had been there since 1981. That she had been waiting in the hiss, in the space underneath Tobias, for 43 years. That Arthur Doyle had heard her breathing, and he had not heard her speak. And had decided, I think, that she would speak when she was ready. And had died in 2003, without ever finding out who she had been ready for. She had been ready for me. I did not tell Hector about Arthur's notebook. Hector died that spring, before I could decide whether to tell him. And at his funeral I stood at the back of the small church in Pleasant Cove, and I listened to a minister who had not known Hector describe him as a quiet servant of the community, which was true in the way those things are usually true, which is to say partially. Afterward, his nephew, whose name was Daniel, which I had not known until that morning, and which cost me something to hear, asked if I still had Hector's notebooks. I said I did. He said, "Are they worth anything?" I said, "Not in the way you mean." He nodded, and he said, "Keep them then." And he went back into the church. I drove back to the Cape that afternoon, and I added Arthur Doyle's notebook to the cardboard box under my bed. 9 notebooks, 3 keepers, 46 years of one dead man's voice, and, hidden underneath it, the patient, breathing presence of a woman who had waited 43 years to be heard, and 4 years to say my name, and who was, by then, saying it with an intimacy I had stopped pretending was accidental. I want to stop here and acknowledge something, because if I do not, I think you may stop listening, and I do not want you to. The story I am telling you is not in the end a story about a haunted radio. The radio is real, and the voices are real to me, but the story is about what I did with them. I have spent 9 winters being given something extraordinary. And I have spent 9 winters arranging my life so that no one else could have it. I lied to a young woman who deserved the truth. I have signed inventory forms I knew to be inaccurate. I have not, in 9 years, picked up the microphone and answered Tobias Ellery, even on the nights when he asks, very quietly, for art. I have not, until very recently, answered the woman who says my name. I have kept the watch, in the way Arthur Doyle and Hector Brennan kept the watch. But I have kept it for a reason they did not have, which is that I have come to need it. If you are someone who listens to stories like this often, you may already be ahead of me. You may have understood several minutes ago that the woman is not really the point. The point is what the woman gave me permission to become. A person who lives at the end of a road, alone, by choice, listening for something only she can hear, and arranging the rest of her life around the protection of that listening. That is a recognizable shape. I have seen it in summer, in some of the tourists who come out to the museum and stand a little too long at the railing, looking at the water like they are trying to see something specific. I used to feel sorry for those people. I do not anymore. I understand them. That is a worse thing than feeling sorry for them. Margot came back to the Cape in my 8th summer after Hector's funeral. She had not been doing the tours for 2 years by then. She was working in Halifax at an archive. She drove out one Saturday in July with a thermos of coffee and a small bakery box. And she sat at my kitchen table, and she said, "Eleanor, I want to ask you again." I said, "Ask me what?" She said, "Whether there are notebooks." I had had 2 years to prepare for this question, and I had not prepared. I had assumed she would not come back. I had assumed her interest had moved on, because that is what I would have wanted to be true. I sat across from her, and I looked at her face, which had become, in 2 years, the face of a woman rather than a young woman. And I understood that she had not come back because she had a new idea. She had come back because she had not been able to let the old one go. That recognition, that she had been carrying this for 2 years the way I had been carrying it for 8, was the closest I came, in all those winters, to telling the truth. I did not tell it. I said, "Margot, there are no notebooks. I know that is not what you wanted to hear. I know you came out here for a reason. I'm sorry, I cannot help you." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Eleanor, my grandfather told me, before he died last year, that Arthur Doyle told him in 1979 that he had heard Tobias Ellery on the radio at the Cape, a year after the Marisol went down. He told my grandfather he had decided not to report it. My grandfather told me this because he wanted me to know that the men who kept this station were not always the men the official records said they were. He told me because he thought I might find what they had hidden, and he thought, if I did, that I would handle it gently." She looked at me across the table. She said, "I think you have notebooks, Eleanor. I am not going to push you. I am only going to tell you that I think you do, and that whatever is in them, I am the right person to read them, and that I will not be the right person forever. I have a job offer in Vancouver. I'm probably going to take it. If you want to give them to me, you have until the end of August." She left the bakery box on the table. She drove away. I sat in the kitchen until the light changed, and then I made myself stand up. And I went into the bedroom, and I looked at the box under the bed, and I looked at the cupboard with the notebooks in it, and I did what I have done at every important moment of the last 9 years, which is nothing. August ended. Margot went to Vancouver. The night she would have left, if I had to guess, sometime around the 28th of August. The conditions in the kitchen were wrong for a transmission, The air too warm, the pressure too high. But the radio hissed anyway. For the first time in any summer I had been here. For about 4 seconds. And the woman said, very softly, "Eleanor, you are not going to do it, are you?" And the hiss closed before I could decide whether she had been asking me or telling me. I sat at the table for a long time. I understood, sometime past midnight, that she had not been disappointed. She had been relieved. I want you, if you are still with me, to consider whether you would have given Margot the notebooks. Not in the abstract, not as a moral question, as a real one. Most people, when I imagine telling them this story, say, of course they would have. I would like to believe them. I think if you sit with it honestly, you might find that the answer is more complicated than you want it to be. The radio gave me something I could not get anywhere else. The notebooks were the only evidence that it was real. To give them away was to make the gift smaller. I do not know a person who has been given a private thing and asked to share it, who has not, at least once, said no for reasons they could not entirely defend. The 7th winter was the hardest. There was a storm in early February that took out the power to the cottage for 6 days, and the backup generator failed on the 3rd day. And I lived for 3 nights on candles and a wood stove and a battery lamp. And the radio, which ran on the cottage's electrical system, was silent through all of it. I had not realized, until then, how much of my winter had reorganized itself around the possibility of those transmissions. I was not waiting for Tobias. I was waiting for her. When the power came back on the 7th day and the hiss did not come for another 2 weeks, I found myself doing something I had not done in years, which was praying in the loose, unfocused way of a person who has not believed in anything specific for a long time, but who has not entirely stopped hoping that something is listening. I prayed she would come back, when she did, on the night of February the 22nd, and said, "Eleanor, the wind is bad tonight, isn't it?" I cried at the kitchen table for the first time since Daniel had died. I do not know what to do with that fact, except to tell it to you. I had not cried for my husband in over a decade. I cried for a voice on a radio inside 3 weeks of not hearing it. If you want to understand what isolation does to a person, do not look at the loneliness. Look at what the loneliness, after long enough, agrees to call company. The 9th winter, this winter, the one I'm sitting in as I tell you this, has been different in one way. Tobias Ellery has come through less often, 4 times since November, where in past years I would have expected 8 or 9 by now. The conditions have not been unusual. The equipment, as far as I can tell, has not changed. He has simply been quieter. I have wondered, the way you wonder about a relative you have not heard from in a while, whether something is wrong with him. Which is an absurd thing to wonder about a man who has been dead for 46 years, and which is exactly the kind of thought I have started having, and stopped being embarrassed by. The woman has come through more often, 11 times since November. She has begun to say longer things. She has said, "Eleanor, the kettle is whistling," on a night when the kettle was, in fact, whistling. And I had not noticed. She has said, "Eleanor, you have not eaten today," on a day when I had not. She has said, "Eleanor, you should put another log on a night when the stove was burning low and I had been about to. She has said twice, "Eleanor, you should write to the girl." The girl. I have not told the radio about Margot. I have not said her name in the kitchen. I have not, as far as I can remember, said her name aloud at all since the afternoon she left. You should write to the girl. I do not know what to do with that, except to tell you about it, which is itself a form of doing something, I suppose, though probably not the form she means. I want to tell you about 3 nights ago, because it is the reason I am finally talking, and because it is the thing that, more than anything else that has happened on this Cape in 9 winters, has made me understand that I do not entirely know whose kitchen this is anymore. The conditions were right. The pressure had fallen sharply in the afternoon, and the fog came up the cliff after sunset in that climbing, vertical way. And I sat at the kitchen table with the red notebook open, because the yellow is full, and I have not started a new one. The hiss came up at 10:20. Tobias Ellery said his name and his vessel and his position. He said, "Please do not answer." He said the line about the bilge pump, then the polite stretch. Then the hiss thinned, and the kitchen got that hollowed-out feeling, and I understood she was about to speak. She said, "Eleanor." I said out loud, into the kitchen, "Yes." It was the first time in 9 winters that I had answered her. My voice sounded strange to me, because I had not used it for several days. It came out quieter than I meant it to. There was a pause that was longer than any pause I've ever heard on that radio. The hiss stayed open. I could hear, underneath it, the small, irregular sounds I have always heard underneath it, which I have always told myself were the sea or the wind or the equipment, and which that night sounded, for the first time, exactly like a room with someone in it. Someone breathing, the way a person breathes when they are listening very carefully. Then she said, "Good." I sat with my hands flat on the wood of the table, the way I always sit when something has happened on the radio that I do not understand. And I waited, the way I always wait, for the hiss to close. It did not close. It thinned further, almost to silence. And then, in that almost silence, she said one more thing. She said, "Eleanor, please do not answer." It was Tobias's line. It was the line he had been saying since 1982, since the night Hector picked up the microphone, since the moment Tobias understood that someone on the other end was capable of speaking back. She said it in her own voice, calmly, gently, the way you might tell a child not to touch a stove that is still warm. And then the hiss closed, and the kitchen was the kitchen again, and the kettle, which had been about to whistle, whistled. And I got up, and I poured the water over the tea bag, and I sat back down, and I looked at the red notebook, and I did not write any of it down. I have not heard her since. The conditions have not been right. I have not heard Tobias either. It has been 3 days. The cottage has been very quiet. I notice in the silence that I am listening for both of them now. I notice that I am, for the first time, in 9 winters, afraid of what it would mean if I never heard either of them again. I notice also that I am, for the first time in 9 winters, afraid of what it would mean if I did. I will tell you what I think happened, although I want to be careful, because what I think is not the same as what I know. I think Tobias Ellery has been warning her. All this time, the way he warned Hector, the way he warns every keeper. Please do not answer. I think the woman, whoever she is, whatever she is what happens on this radio when a keeper answers. I think Arthur Doyle understood this in 1981 and did not tell anyone, because by then it was too late to put her back. I think Hector understood it too, in his own way, which is why he stopped writing things down, and why he handed me his notebooks, and why he looked at me across this table that first afternoon, with an expression I now recognize as the expression of a man passing a weight to the next person willing to carry it. I think the woman has been waiting, since 1981, for a keeper alone enough and quiet enough and emptied enough by grief to answer her without picking up the microphone. I think I answered her, the first time, on the night I dreamed about Daniel, and did not say his name aloud. I think every time I sat at this table and refused to tell Hector about her, and refused to give the notebooks to Margot, and refused to write what she said in the red notebook, I was answering her again, in a language quieter than speech, in the language she had been listening for. I think 3 nights ago, when I said yes out loud, I was only confirming a thing she had already understood for years. I think what she said back, when she said good, was not an approval. It was a completion. I do not know what comes next. I have considered in the 3 days since writing to Margot. I have considered driving down to Pleasant Cove and finding a stamp and an envelope and writing a short letter that says, "Margot, I lied to you. There are 9 notebooks. Come and get them whenever you can. I will be here if I'm still here." I have considered it the way I have considered everything else, which is fully and seriously, and without doing it. I will tell you what I think I have learned, although I want to be careful, because the kind of learning I am talking about is not the kind that becomes a lesson. I have learned that a person can be given something extraordinary and can spend the rest of their life arranging not to share it, and can call that arrangement, depending on the day, vigilance or stewardship or love or simple privacy, and can mean it every time, and can still be doing the same thing under all of those names, which is keeping. I have learned that keeping is not the same as caring. Arthur Doyle kept the watch, and Hector Brennan kept the watch, and I have kept the watch, and the watch has, in all 3 of our cases, been kept partly for the man on the radio and partly for ourselves, and the proportion has shifted in each generation, and in my generation, it has shifted further than I am comfortable saying out loud. There is one more thing I want you to know, before I stop. Last night, very late, after I had given up on the conditions and gone to bed, I woke up because I thought I heard the kettle. The kitchen was dark, the stove was off, the kettle was cold. I stood in the doorway in my nightgown for a long time, and I listened, and the kettle did not whistle because the kettle was not on. But from the radio above the table, in a hiss so faint I would have missed it if I'd not been standing perfectly still, I heard a woman's voice say, very gently, in the cadence I have come to know better than my own, "Eleanor, the kettle is whistling." It was not. I went back to bed. I did not sleep. The hiss is starting again now, just under the sound of the wind on the eastern window, very faint, the way it always starts. The barometer has fallen another point in the last hour. The fog is climbing past the kitchen window in the slow vertical way that means the conditions are turning. I'm going to stop talking now and listen. If Tobias comes through, I will write him down, the way I always have in the red notebook in short factual lines, the way Arthur Doyle taught Hector and Hector taught me. If she comes through, I do not know what I will do. I think I will answer her. I think I have been answering her for a long time without knowing it, and that the only honest thing left is to do it out loud. I think, also, that somewhere in the next several winters, a new keeper will come to this cottage. They will open the cupboard, and they will find the notebooks, and they will sit at this table, and one cold night the hiss will come up, and they will hear a man named Tobias Ellery ask, very politely, please not to answer. And then, after the polite stretch, after the hiss thins and the kitchen takes on that hollowed-out feeling, they will hear a woman's voice. The voice will say a name. I do not think it will be Tobias's name. I do not think it will be the woman's name either. I think, when that night comes, the voice will say, Eleanor. And the new keeper, sitting in my chair in my kitchen under my light, will not know who that is, and will write it down in their own first notebook, in careful blue ink. And the watch will go on being kept in the way it has always been kept, by people who arrived alone and stayed alone, and were in the end given exactly the company they had been quiet enough to deserve. The kettle is starting to whistle. I did not put it on. I am going to go and answer it now.